A dark woman speaks, and the entire court goes silent. When the Navy SEAL responds, "You think you can take me down? You have no idea who you're messing with." That was the last thing Felicia Rivers heard before the line went dead. A powerful real estate mogul had stolen her grandmother's home, leaving her family devastated, but Felicia wasn't about to back down. She took him to court, determined to expose the truth. At first, it seemed like just another fraud case, until a Navy SEAL walked into the courtroom. What he revealed changed everything. The entire room fell silent. Even the judge leaned forward, because this wasn't just about stolen property anymore. This was about something much, much bigger. Stay tuned, because this story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. A Monday morning sun cast bright shafts of light across the polished floors of the U.S. District Court in Bayview City, an oceanside metropolis known for its thriving shipping industry and adjacent military presence. Reporters, attorneys, and curious bystanders bustled about in the lofty marble lobby, forming an eclectic wave of suits, microphones, and anxious faces. Everyone was here for one reason: the high-profile trial of Victor Vance Barlow. Inside courtroom 2B, wooden pews creaked under the weight of onlookers and media personnel. The overhead lights were stark, illuminating the wide expanse of the space. Four flags stood behind the bench: the United States flag, the state flag, the city banner, and the U.S. District Court emblem. Judge Carmen Ramirez was known for her sharp intellect and intolerance for melodrama in her courtroom. She had presided over drug rings and racketeering cases with a calm, unwavering hand. But even she seemed to sense that today would be different. On one side of the courtroom, the prosecution team arranged thick files labeled Barlow fraud, money laundering, and Barlow threats, harassment. Seated among them was Felicia Rivers, a poised dark woman in her early 30s with an air of quiet determination. Her crisp, cream-colored blouse and neatly pinned-back curls belied the tension swirling around her. She clutched a small notebook in her left hand, the knuckles showing white from her grip. Across the aisle sat the defense, including Victor Barlow himself. Victor was a man of imposing height and lean muscle, wearing a tailored dark suit that accentuated his self-assured stance. His hair was styled neatly, and though he sat next to his lawyer, he exuded a sense of being fully in control, smiling occasionally as if the trial were merely a formality. Felicia had waited for this day for nearly a year, ever since her grandmother, Loretta Rivers, lost her beloved Victorian-style home in a suspicious real estate deal. The house had been in their family for 3 generations, perched at the edge of a neighborhood that was rapidly gentrifying. They were told that a real estate syndicate wanted to buy the house at a fair price and help Loretta move into a safer area. In truth, the paperwork was riddled with hidden clauses, inflated fees, and forged documents. Within months, Loretta found herself evicted, her property snatched up, and minimal compensation provided. Felicia soon discovered that the man at the center of this operation was Victor Vance Barlow, known by many in the community for unscrupulous deals but never formally caught. As the bailiff called the courtroom to order, Felicia ran her fingertips across the rough edges of her notebook, remembering how tirelessly she had worked to gather enough evidence to bring the case forward. It was not just about her grandmother's house. Rumors persisted that Victor had participated in laundering large sums of money for dangerous entities, perhaps even foreign ones, yet no one had solid proof until now. Judge Ramirez stepped up to the bench, her black robes trailing behind her like a shadow. She peered at the defense table, then the prosecution. "Good morning," she said, projecting a steady voice that commanded everyone's attention. "We are here today for United States v. Victor Barlow, case number 4478. Counsel, please state your appearances." Brian Foster, the lead prosecutor, rose. "Brian Foster for the U.S. Attorney's Office, Your Honor. With me is Assistant U.S. Attorney Susan Clark, and we have multiple witnesses prepared to testify." Defense counsel stood next. "Arthur Ross, Your Honor, representing the defendant, Mr. Barlow, who is present." Victor gave a half-smile, nodding at the judge, who offered no acknowledgement. Instead, she said, "Very well. Counsel for the prosecution, you may proceed with your opening statement." Foster paced to the center of the courtroom, buttoning his suit jacket. He began with a calm, methodical tone, summarizing how evidence would show that Victor had orchestrated a complex network of fraudulent real estate schemes, acquiring properties at well below market value through coercion and forgery, and then flipping them to launder money. We will also present credible testimony, Foster said, from Miss Felicia Rivers, whose family fell victim to Barlow's manipulations, and from others who have seen firsthand the intimidation tactics used to silence those who might stand in his way. At the mention of Felicia's name, Victor's eyes flicked her way. There was the faintest hint of a smirk, as though he considered her just another inconvenience. Felicia steeled herself, determined not to let him rattle her. When the prosecution finished, the defense rose. Arthur Ross made a polished speech about how his client was a successful businessman targeted by people who envied his achievements. He portrayed Felicia as a scorned accuser who failed to read the fine print. He insisted that the alleged money laundering was nothing but speculative leaps by an overzealous prosecutor. Felicia felt the blood rise to her cheeks. She glanced at Foster, who appeared unruffled. This was exactly the line they had expected. Judge Ramirez invited the prosecution to call its first witness. A city records clerk testified about forged titles and suspicious transfers. Next, a local bank manager explained abnormal patterns in Victor's accounts. Both offered technical, somewhat dry testimony, but it built the bedrock of the prosecution's case. The moment that Felicia had anticipated for months arrived after lunch recess, when Foster finally said, "Your Honor, the government calls Miss Felicia Rivers." A hush fell. Felicia stood, smoothing her blouse, and walked to the witness stand. She was sworn in, hands trembling slightly as she affirmed to tell the truth. She sat down, meeting the judge's calm gaze for a moment. She allowed herself a steadying breath. She looked outward at the jurors, at the handful of reporters scribbling notes, at a defiant Victor Barlow, who still wore that self-assured grin, and she began. Felicia started by painting a picture of her grandmother, Loretta, a woman of 82 years who had lived in her Victorian house since childhood. "My grandmother always believed in the good of people," Felicia said softly, her voice resonating through the silent courtroom. "She raised me on that same principle. Treat others with kindness, and they'll do the same." But then, we met Victor Barlow. Foster nodded. "Could you tell us how your grandmother first came into contact with Mr. Barlow?" Felicia explained how Loretta was approached by a woman claiming to be a realtor with a property investment firm. She spoke of a beneficial deal. Felicia continued, her voice shaking slightly. She said Victor was a reputable businessman who wanted to help older homeowners move to safer, updated communities. "My grandmother was considering downsizing anyway. She found it hard to climb the old stairs." Victor shifted in his seat, flicking an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve, visibly bored. "Could you describe," asked Foster, "how this deal progressed?" Felicia took a deep breath. "We were shown documents. They looked legitimate, but were full of jargon neither of us understood. The realtor said, 'Don't worry, Mr. Barlow has a special program. He'll even pay for the moving expenses.' That reassured my grandmother, so she signed, trusting him." Her voice grew tighter. "Within months, we received an eviction notice. The documents were completely different from what we believed we'd signed. Suddenly, the house wasn't in her name at all, and the buyout money was a fraction of what we'd been promised. I tried reaching out to the realtor, to Victor, but we were ignored." A murmur rippled through the spectators. Judge Ramirez gave a sharp look, and silence returned. "Miss Rivers," Foster said gently, "did you attempt to speak directly to Mr. Barlow about these inconsistencies?" Felicia nodded. "I called his office, left messages. Eventually, I managed to catch him by phone. I told him who I was, that I wanted an explanation. He told me," she paused, her eyes darting from Victor to the jury. "He told me he would have no issue throwing us out if we didn't stay quiet and accept what we'd been given." One of the jurors, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked at Victor in disbelief. Another juror pursed his lips, seemingly troubled by the alleged callousness. Foster let Felicia's words settle before asking, "So, you decided to take legal action?" "Yes, though it wasn't easy." Felicia's voice grew firmer. "But I discovered it wasn't just us. Another family had faced a similar issue. That's when I learned that the FBI and local law enforcement were investigating something bigger, money laundering." She hesitated, glancing briefly at Victor. "And we found out Mr. Barlow's company was at the center of it." Foster handed Felicia a folder. "Exhibit 14, Your Honor. Emails between Miss Rivers and an attorney she consulted, referencing the suspicious nature of the real estate documents." The judge permitted it into evidence, and the defense counsel only shook his head, waiting to cross-examine. Thank you, Miss Rivers, Foster said, stepping away. No further questions at this time. Defense attorney Arthur Ross rose. He projected a courteous smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Miss Rivers, you said your grandmother had trouble with the stairs in her home and wished to move, correct? Felicia nodded. That's correct. And you found a buyer who offered a sum of money. Did you look over the papers yourself or hire an independent real estate lawyer? Felicia stiffened at the insinuation. At the time, we couldn't afford a lawyer. It's true I didn't fully understand the documents. I see. Ross made a show of leafing through a file. So, you signed, albeit unknowingly, and now you blame my client for your own lack of due diligence? Felicia's jaw tightened. It wasn't due diligence I lacked. Your client's documents were falsified. The signature on some forms wasn't even my grandmother's. Investigators can confirm that. Ross raised an eyebrow. That's your interpretation, Miss Rivers. He paced, making sure the jury could hear his every step. Now, earlier you stated my client threatened you. Did he physically threaten you? Or was it a figure of speech, meaning he would enforce his rights as the new property owner? There was a subtle shift in Felicia's expression. She recalled the venom in Victor's voice. It was a threat, she said, unwavering. He said we wouldn't stand a chance if we fought back. A hint of exasperation colored Ross's posture. And you are certain you didn't misunderstand the conversation? Felicia met his eyes. I am certain. Ross wrapped up with a dismissive smile. No further questions. Felicia stepped down, heart pounding. She noticed that Victor didn't even look at her as she returned to her seat. He just adjusted his cufflinks, as though what she said was beneath his notice. The afternoon trudged on with more documents, more witnesses, financial analysts, a real estate broker who had severed ties with Victor, and even a handwriting expert verifying the forged signatures. The prosecution laid down piece after piece, erecting a meticulous framework of evidence. Yet, to Felicia's frustration, the defense was adept at sowing small seeds of doubt, circumstantial, ambiguous, no direct link to Mr. Barlow. She couldn't deny they were skilled at evasion, painting Victor as merely an investor, disclaiming any knowledge of wrongdoing by underlings. The day ended with little sense of closure, leaving the audience hungry for the next bombshell. Exhausted, Felicia emerged from the courthouse into the fading daylight. Reporters snapped photos, microphones thrust forward. Miss Rivers, do you believe your testimony was strong enough? One asked. She offered no response, focusing instead on weaving through the crowd. She just wanted to get home. The trail to convict Victor was precarious and long, and tomorrow promised more legal wrangling. Little did she know that the greatest drama was yet to unfold, that a new witness, wholly unexpected, would turn this trial into a national spectacle before the week was out. The second day of trial arrived with a downpour. Rain soused down the courthouse windows, shrouding the morning in a somber veil. Inside the building's main hallway, attorneys, paralegals, and spectators shook off umbrellas and stepped onto the glossy tiles. Felicia slipped through the crowd, head bowed against the weather, replaying every word of her testimony in her mind. She found Brian Foster speaking quietly with another prosecutor near the elevators. Foster waved her over. "Morning, Miss Rivers," he greeted. "We have a new development. We've secured a witness from the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, a lieutenant commander named Marcus K. Boone. We plan to call him later today." Felicia's eyebrows rose. A Navy SEAL? How does he factor into a real estate fraud trial? Foster exchanged a glance with his colleague. "We believe Mr. Boone has relevant testimony regarding Victor Barlow's broader network. There's reason to suspect that money from these property flips was being funneled to arms dealers overseas." Felicia's pulse quickened. "That's serious. But how did a Navy SEAL get involved?" "That's what we'll find out," Foster replied cryptically. Word traveled fast in a courthouse. By mid-morning, rumors had spread that a high-ranking Navy SEAL would be testifying. The press coverage ballooned, with journalists speculating about national security angles. Some whispered that the Department of Defense had a stake in the outcome. Others dismissed it as a sensational rumor. Even Felicia wondered if the connection could be that far-reaching. Court reconvened promptly at 9 a.m. The defense continued cross-examining the prosecution's financial experts, trying to portray them as overstepping the data or misreading the documents. Judge Ramirez reined in the more theatrical objections, keeping the testimony on track. At around 11:30 a.m., Foster rose with an air of significance that made the room fall silent. Your Honor, the government calls Lieutenant Commander Marcus Boone of the United States Navy. The bailiff opened the double doors at the back of the courtroom, and in walked a tall man with a confident stride, wearing his Navy dress uniform. Felicia noticed how the entire courtroom seemed to shift. Reporters craned their necks, a hush fell over the crowd, and even Victor's perpetual smirk faltered for a moment. The uniform bore the insignia of a naval special warfare officer, and ribbons of achievement lined his chest. He removed his cover hat before approaching the witness stand. Judge Ramirez's normally stern visage softened in respect. Lieutenant Commander, please raise your right hand. After swearing in, Marcus Boone, whom Foster occasionally called Mark, sat upright in the witness box. Foster began gently. Lieutenant Commander, could you state your role at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado? Yes, sir, Boone said, voice steady. I serve as part of the instructional cadre and special operations planning. I've also participated in multiple deployments in counterterrorism and anti-smuggling operations. A ripple of awe traveled through the spectators. The mere mention of counterterrorism suggested real gravitas. Could you explain, Foster asked, how your duties intersect with the allegations against Mr. Barlow? Boone's gaze remained direct. My team worked with federal investigators on a joint task force targeting global arms trafficking. During the course of that task force, we uncovered evidence of suspicious real estate transactions used to launder money that ended up supporting illicit arms deals. Gasps fluttered around the room. The notion that Victor's property deals extended beyond local swindles was jarring. Felicia felt her heart pick up pace. If this was true, it meant Victor wasn't just a con artist. He was entangled in potentially deadly global operations. Judge Ramirez leaned forward. Proceed, Commander. Foster signaled Boone to continue. Federal data led us to suspect that certain U.S.-based groups were funneling payments to shell companies. We cross-referenced these transactions with public real estate records. Mr. Barlow's name appeared repeatedly as an intermediary. Victor stiffened, his attorney, Ross, glancing at him nervously. It was one thing to debate whether Victor tricked gullible homeowners, quite another to face allegations of funding arms dealers abroad. Commander Boone, Foster said, did you ever directly observe Mr. Barlow's involvement? Yes, we had an undercover operative embedded in a ring that trafficked high-end firearms. Phone logs, wire transfers, and even in-person meetings pointed to a real estate scheme that Mr. Barlow either managed or facilitated. We found repeated references, like VB, in coded communications. Ross jumped to his feet. Objection. Hearsay. The commander is testifying about statements made outside of court. Judge Ramirez tilted her head. Mr. Foster. Foster nodded. We'll submit documentation. The commander is laying a foundation for these records, Your Honor. Overruled for now, the judge decided, but watch your line of questioning, Mr. Foster. We need direct evidence or appropriate expert testimony. Yes, Your Honor, Foster acknowledged. Then, turning back to Boone, he asked, to clarify, can you confirm the authenticity of the documents cross-referencing VB? Boone nodded. Absolutely. Our intelligence unit, in partnership with the U.S. Treasury, verified the bank transactions. In total, we linked over $2 million passing through accounts controlled or partially owned by Mr. Barlow's organizations. An audible murmur traveled across the pews. Even some journalists stared in astonishment. Felicia found herself exhaling slowly. This was a bombshell, tying Victor to a much larger criminal web. Victor's fists tightened on the defense table. Felicia could almost see the calculation in his eyes, the recognition that the stakes had soared. It wasn't just about forging a few signatures now. It was about whether he had facilitated global arms deals. As Foster continued questioning, Boone laid out the operational details. He carefully avoided classified specifics, but the gist was clear. Victor's fraudulent property flips helped launder dirty money that eventually reached criminal militias in conflict zones. That alone could lead to a litany of federal charges, dwarfing the local real estate fraud case. When Foster concluded his direct examination, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Here stood a decorated Navy SEAL, a figure of unimpeachable authority, testifying that Victor Barlow posed a threat to national security. Felicia glanced over at the jury box. Some jurors looked unsettled, grappling with the gravity of this revelation. Defense attorney Ross cleared his throat, stepping forward. Commander Boone, you mentioned that your task force uncovered evidence. Could you specify how you're qualified to interpret financial records, given you're a military officer? Boone responded calmly. I work closely with intelligence analysts trained in financial forensics. My unit also assisted in raids that recovered documentation. In these capacities, I became personally familiar with the transactions. Ross sniffed. But you have no official accreditation in forensic accounting, correct? I do not, Boone conceded, but I rely on reports from accredited specialists within my unit and partner agencies. Ross seized on the opening. So your testimony is secondhand at best? Not entirely, Boone said. I was physically present during an operation overseas where we seized digital ledgers referencing Mr. Barlow's real estate holdings. I personally witnessed the correlation between these logs and stateside property transactions. The chain of custody is intact. I can certify that. Ross's lips pressed together. He pivoted, scanning for another angle to attack, but the unimpeachable aura of a Navy SEAL, plus the chain of custody references, left few footholds. No further questions, he grumbled finally. Judge Ramirez signaled Boone to step down, but Foster stopped him with a gesture. Your Honor, the government respectfully requests the witness remain available. We plan to connect his testimony with subsequent exhibits. Nodding, Bennett said, Commander, you may remain in the witness waiting area. We appreciate your cooperation. James Boone gave a slight bow and left the stand, passing mere feet from where Victor sat. For the first time, Felicia detected a flash of genuine alarm in Victor's eyes. Gone was his smug facade. He seemed to sense that this trial had escalated to a realm far beyond typical white-collar crime. As the lunch recess was announced, Felicia walked outside into the drizzling rain. She felt the eyes of the press trailing her, but she also noticed that many cameras now focused on the imposing silhouette of Lieutenant Commander Boone. The swirl of speculation about national security was overshadowing even her personal story, yet Felicia had no regrets. If anything, the deeper this went, the more certain she became that Victor deserved to face full accountability. Outside, she couldn't help but wonder if the next hours or days would bring even more shocking revelations. Instinct told her they would, and she intended to stand firm, no matter how large the stakes became. That afternoon, in a private conference room within the courthouse, Felicia sat with Foster, Boone, and a few other agents involved in the broader investigation. The fluorescent lighting flickered overhead, casting shadows on the stacked boxes of evidence that crowded the small space. Foster wasted no time. We need to piece together a clear timeline, so the jury can't get lost in the complexity. Commander, you said your team discovered these logs in a raid overseas. James Boone nodded, folding his arms. That's correct. We were operating in a region where smuggled arms were fueling a local conflict. During a joint operation with Allied forces, we confiscated laptops and hard drives from a known arms broker. On those drives were multiple references to a person called V. Barlow, or simply VB. We saw repeated instructions to move funds via Redwood Realty, a shell company, if I'm not mistaken. And Felicia leaned forward. Redwood Realty? That name came up in my search too. They were the ones who initially approached my grandmother. Foster sighed. That lines up with the fraudulent real estate deals used as fronts. Redwood Realty would buy homes at artificially low prices, but some of those purchases never even went on the public record until after the property changed hands multiple times. The money bouncing around was likely laundered. Boone tapped the table. Exactly. My unit traced that laundered money to known arms traffickers, and Redwood Realty, from what I've seen, has direct ties to Victor Barlow. Felicia recalled the Redwood Realty letterhead that had once seemed so professional. It sickened her to think that her grandmother's property was not just stolen, but used to bankroll destructive weapon shipments. She asked, is there any mention of intimidation tactics? Because I know of at least 3 families threatened into selling. Boone exhaled, glancing at Foster. I can't speak to that directly, but from what our informants have said, Redwood employed strong-arm tactics. If a homeowner hesitated, Redwood's representatives implied legal or even physical consequences. A hush fell in the small room. Every person there realized how many vulnerable people had been taken advantage of. Felicia felt a surge of renewed determination. So, how do we make all this hit home for the jury? Foster flipped open a binder. We'll present the chain of evidence. Redwood's ties to overseas arms deals, Redwood's forging of real estate deeds, Redwood's intimidation. Then, we tie Redwood directly to Victor. The last piece is to show that these deals also harmed ordinary citizens, like Miss Rivers's family. Felicia nodded. And the Navy SEAL angle? Boone gave a slight smile. I'm prepared to testify further about our global findings, but I'm aware the defense will claim that's beyond scope or not relevant to local real estate fraud. That's why we need to emphasize how Victor's laundering is part of the same scheme that defrauded families here. Foster closed the binder with a crisp snap. Commander, your credibility is invaluable. We can't overplay it, or the defense might say we're sensationalizing. But make no mistake, your testimony could be the linchpin in convicting Barlow. Felicia felt a wave of gratitude that someone with Boone's stature and moral clarity had stepped in. Thank you, Commander, she said quietly, for everything. Boone offered a small nod. It's part of the job, Miss Rivers. We protect American citizens from threats, whether they're on foreign soil or in our own backyard. Meanwhile, on the other side of the courthouse, Victor Barlow fumed in a dimly lit consultation room with his defense attorney. Arthur Ross was hunched over pages of new evidence just provided by the prosecution. Victor, you didn't tell me you had international ties. This goes way beyond petty fraud. Victor slammed a fist on the table. I didn't think they'd trace that far. Those deals were arranged through middlemen. I barely touched them. You're knee-deep, Ross said, voice low. We've got a decorated Navy SEAL testifying that your real estate flips funded arms dealers. This is turning into a national security case. Victor rubbed his temples. Then we need to discredit him. Make it sound like he's exaggerating. How can a soldier prove a real estate chain? He's no accountant. Ross sighed. We can try to chip away at his expertise, but the prosecution says they have actual documents, chain of custody reports. If the jury believes it, you're looking at a potential decades-long sentence. Panic flickered across Victor's face, but he forced a tight laugh. I won't go down without a fight. What if we can shift blame to Redwood Realty? Rogue agents? I'll say I was just a figurehead. He stared at his lawyer. Think that'll work. Ross pressed his lips together. It's a long shot, but I'll do what I can. One misstep in the chain of evidence, one procedural error, and we can ask for a mistrial. But you have to keep calm in court, or the jury will see you rattled. Victor squared his shoulders, forcing composure. Fine, let's do it. Despite the bravado, a chill had set in. Victor knew his carefully constructed empire was teetering, threatened by a single man in uniform who had dared to connect the local property scams to an international web of crime. Victor wasn't prepared to lose everything he'd built, but like a cornered animal, he was growing unpredictable. The next morning, the prosecution returned to financial evidence. They presented spreadsheets, deposit slips, and escrow accounts. The defense repeatedly tried to cast doubt, but the data was voluminous. Each time Ross objected, Foster responded with more facts. Felicia's stomach knotted as she watched. She felt powerless, just sitting there, and the math-heavy presentations made some jurors visibly weary. The documents proved vital, yet didn't deliver the emotional punch that might seal Victor's fate. Something was missing, a direct link, a bridging piece that showed that the same intimidation Felicia described was part of the global scheme. At one point, Judge Ramirez called for a short recess. Felicia stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, heading to a second-floor balcony that overlooked the city's waterfront. The sky was clear, the sun glinting off the harbor. She leaned against the railing, eyes closed, letting the salty breeze wash over her. Tension, a voice startled her. Miss Rivers. She turned to see Commander Boone approaching, still in his dress uniform, though his jacket was unbuttoned now, in a more relaxed manner. She offered a polite smile. Commander, or should I say Mr. Boone. He smiled. Mark is fine when we aren't in session. I wanted to say that your courage in testifying is admirable. Many civilians shy away from going against someone as influential as Barlow. Felicia's cheeks warmed. Thank you. Honestly, it's terrifying. Victor exudes this aura of untouchability, and the lawyers, the cameras, it's a lot. Boone's gaze flicked over the harbor. I get it. Different battlefield, but a battle nonetheless. I've fought in places where you can't let fear paralyze you. Here, it's a war of words and evidence. But the principle is the same. Stand your ground. Trust the team. She nodded, mindful of how easy it was to talk to him. That's what I keep telling myself. It's for my grandmother, but it's also for the other families he victimized. I just never imagined it would connect to arms trafficking. His face hardened. Unfortunately, corruption has deep roots. Criminals exploit everyday avenues real estate, nonprofits, shipping retesto finance bigger evils. Your family's predicament is what our unit calls a collateral casualty. Felicia swallowed hard, a sense of anger at how innocently her grandmother had been deceived. Well, I'm glad you're shining a light on it. Without your team's findings, we might have lost. Boone placed a reassuring hand on the balcony rail. We'll keep pushing. But be careful, Miss Rivers. Barlow may feel cornered. A fleeting dread clutched Felicia's heart. She remembered the phone call where Victor threatened her. If that was how he acted when his crimes were well hidden, what would he do now? Still, she squared her shoulders, reminded of her own vow. She wouldn't bow to intimidation again. When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. The jury filed back in, chatter halted, and proceedings resumed. Foster called a forensic accountant from the Joint Task Force. She methodically laid out how Redwood Realty's laundered funds traveled from local properties to offshore accounts, eventually connecting to arms brokers. Throughout this dense testimony, the court's tension spiraled. Everyone sensed something bigger was about to happen. Mid-afternoon, Foster glanced at Felicia, gave a small nod, and said, "Your Honor, the prosecution wishes to recall Miss Felicia Rivers for supplemental testimony, tying these findings to her personal dealings with Redwood Realty." Judge Ramirez approved. Felicia returned to the stand, feeling steadier than the first time. This time, the prosecutors asked about the Redwood Realty representative, the contracts, and any threats she had recorded or documented. She recounted, in measured detail, how Redwood's agent insisted on unorthodox procedures, like skipping certain city inspections, claiming they were just formalities. She described how Redwood's closers demanded that all official communications be routed through a private post office box, with no physical address. Foster guided her to explain the final confrontation with Victor on the phone. She recalled his words with haunting clarity. He said, "You can't do anything about it. Redwood has friends in high places." Then, he threatened to ruin my grandmother's credit and make sure we never qualified for another home loan if we went public. A pin-drop silence followed. The judge let the statement hang in the air. Felicia sensed the jury's shock at the brazen threat. Foster stepped back. "No further questions, Your Honor." Ross approached, trying to project confidence. "Miss Rivers, Redwood Realty was a separate entity from Mr. Barlow, correct? On paper, he's an investor. Other people handled the day-to-day operations." Felicia frowned. "On paper, yes, but phone records show Redwood's representatives consulted with him constantly. Those phone records only show calls to an unverified number," Ross countered. "Is that correct?" Felicia kept her composure. "We traced that number to Mr. Barlow. The phone logs placed him at Redwood's office multiple times." Ross smirked, turning to the judge. "Leading speculation, Your Honor." Judge Ramirez looked unimpressed. "The witness is referencing previously introduced phone logs." Overruled. Ross's facade cracked. He glanced at Victor, then nodded curtly. "No further questions." Felicia exhaled and stepped down. She caught Victor's glare, a silent but intense promise of retribution. Yet, for once, fear didn't coil in her stomach. She felt validated. The truth was out. Let him glare. By late afternoon, the courtroom's windows were tinted orange by the setting sun. Jurors shifted in their seats. Foster stood, his voice echoing in the hushed space. "Your Honor, the government requests to recall Lieutenant Commander Marcus Boone for additional testimony. We'd like him to address the Redwood Realty documents we introduced earlier today." A hint of anticipation rippled through the gallery. Victor exchanged frantic whispers with Ross. Boone strode in, uniform crisp, exuding the disciplined calm of a man used to life-or-death missions. He re-swore to tell the truth, then settled into the witness chair. Foster produced a stack of documents. "Commander Boone, have you seen these Redwood Realty internal memos before?" Boone nodded. "Yes, these were part of the digital evidence seized. They detail property transactions, funding routes, and pseudonymous references to arms procurement. Several memos mention Mr. Barlow's direct oversight." A hush fell. Foster placed a page on the overhead projector for the jury's view. It showed a Redwood Realty memo with bullet points. "VB approves final release of funds. Check with VB on property 2373 Glendale. Must finalize shipping route by December 15th. The stark presence of Redwood's own documents, linking VB to shipping routes, hammered the point home. "Commander," Foster said, "can you explain the significance of Redwood referencing shipping routes in these memos?" Boone leaned forward. "In context, these shipping routes correlated with known arms smuggling pathways in the Middle East. We suspect Redwood Realty disguised overseas shipments as construction materials that were, in fact, crates of firearms." A swell of gasps fluttered through the room. Some jurors wore horrified expressions, as if only now grasping that an unassuming real estate company was fueling global violence. Victor's face contorted in barely contained rage. He hissed something to Ross, who tried to calm him. Foster pressed on. "To be absolutely clear, Redwood Realty coordinated transactions that financed and facilitated arms shipments overseas." Boone nodded. "That's correct, based on the data we collected." "Did you find evidence specifically implicating Mr. Barlow as Redwood's orchestrator?" "Yes. Digital signatures from Redwood's emails traced back to accounts used by Mr. Barlow. Passcodes were changed multiple times, but forensic analysis matched them to personal passcodes also used on Mr. Barlow's known email addresses." Ross sprang up. "Objection. Relevance and potential speculation about passcode usage." Judge Ramirez turned a measured gaze upon him. "The witness is referencing documented forensic analysis." Overruled. Ross's frustration was palpable. This was a direct blow to the defense. Data linking Redwood's email passcodes to Victor's personal accounts was nearly impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Foster offered a small, triumphant smile. "No further questions, Commander." Ross rose, shoulders tense. "Commander Boone, can you confirm that all Redwood communications referencing VB necessarily mean Victor Barlow, and not, say, someone else with those initials?" Boone responded calmly. "Given that Redwood's leadership structure is almost exclusively associates of Mr. Barlow and the correlating phone logs, yes, we believe VB stands for him." Ross pounced. "We believe? So it's still an assumption." Boone didn't flinch. "It's an educated conclusion backed by evidence, not a random guess." Ross's jaw set. "Yet you cannot produce a direct email from Mr. Barlow that says, 'I, Victor Barlow, am facilitating arms shipments,' can you?" Boone let a slight smile play on his lips. "Criminal networks rarely produce such direct confessions, counselor. That's why we rely on consistent, corroborated data points. The standard for evidence is beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond all doubt." Ross's lips parted as if to retort, but no words came. A snicker or two rose from the gallery, quickly silenced by a stern glance from Judge Ramirez. Ross finally muttered, "No further questions," returning to his seat, a muscle twitching in his temple. Victor looked livid, but there was little left to argue in the face of methodical testimony from an officer of Boone's stature. Judge Ramirez turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will break for the day and resume tomorrow with any remaining witnesses or evidence. You are reminded not to discuss the case with anyone or consume media coverage about this trial." The gavel rapped once, and the court was dismissed. The energy in the room was electric. Everyone knew the day's revelations marked a turning point. For Felicia, it was as though the final puzzle pieces had slipped into place, exposing the full depravity of Victor Barlow's scheme. As the crowd filtered out, she caught sight of Victor from the corner of her eye. He stared at her with a hateful intensity that made her spine tingle, but then came a gentle hand at her elbow. "Commander Boone, walk with me," he said quietly. She nodded, and they moved out into the corridor. "You did well up there," he told her softly. "So did you," she said, still reeling. "Thank you." He gave a short nod. "Stay vigilant. Barlow's cornered, and men like him can do irrational things." She swallowed, remembering all too well the phone threats. Still, she managed a small smile. "I won't back down now. Not after how far we've come." Their footsteps echoed on the polished floor. Both recognized the swirling media, the throng waiting by the building's entrance. Tomorrow promised a fiery conclusion, and neither of them was certain just how explosive it might get. By the next morning, the entire city seemed aware that a Navy SEAL had implicated Victor Barlow in arms trafficking. News vans lined the streets outside the courthouse, satellite dishes angled skyward. Throngs of protesters and curiosity seekers gathered behind barricades. Some demanded justice for exploited homeowners. Others were simply there for the spectacle. Inside, Tension was tangible. Judge Ramirez arrived, expression cooler than usual, possibly reflecting her irritation with the media circus. She wasted no time calling the session to order. The prosecution wrapped up its case with a final witness, a Redwood Realty insider who had turned state's evidence. This individual confirmed that Redwood took direct orders from Victor, the infiltration of Redwood's computers, and the chain of custody for all digital evidence were meticulously described. The insider's voice trembled under the weight of confession, but every word only further cemented the prosecution's argument. Then, it was the defense's turn. Ross called a corporate lawyer from Redwood to claim that Redwood's records had been hacked or manipulated. However, under cross-examination, the Redwood lawyer admitted having no direct proof of tampering. The defense also attempted to portray Redwood as an unwieldy enterprise, in which Victor was just one investor. Yet for every attempt, the prosecution had a counterpoint: the Redwood insider testimony, the phone logs, the passcodes, the digital ledgers. Too many data points converged on Victor. Finally, after a short recess, both sides delivered closing arguments. Foster spoke with unwavering conviction, detailing the heartbreak inflicted on families like Felicia's and the global implications of funding arms traffickers. One man's greed, he said, pointing subtly at Victor, devastated local communities and jeopardized international security. Ross responded by repeating the same points about lack of direct proof, coincidences, and opportunistic criminals who used Redwood's name without Victor's knowledge. But the energy behind his words felt stale. The weight of evidence seemed insurmountable. That afternoon, Judge Ramirez instructed the jury to deliberate. The hush that fell over the courtroom when the jury exited felt like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm, heavy, expectant, crackling with silent energy. Felicia stepped into the hallway, feeling the adrenaline swirl in her system. She expected the jury might take days, possibly more, to parse the labyrinth of documents and testimony. Foster approached, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've done what we can. Now, it's in the jury's hands." Commander Boone, who'd been speaking with a Department of Justice official, joined them. He was about to say something when a commotion erupted down the corridor. Victor Barlow was shouting at two court officers, pointing an accusatory finger at Felicia. She lied. "This is her vendetta," he spat. With surprising speed, he lunged, as if to close the distance. The officers blocked him, shoving him back. "That's enough," one said sternly. Ross rushed over, grabbing Victor's arm, but Victor continued hurling threats. "You think I'll rot in prison? You're done, do you hear me? I'll..." Judge Ramirez's voice echoed from behind the throng. "I will have order, or I will hold you in contempt." She signaled the bailiff, who quickly escorted Victor away, accompanied by a furious Ross. The sudden outburst only confirmed to everyone present that Victor was at a breaking point. Felicia stood rigid, heart pounding. She felt Boone's steady presence next to her. He gently guided her away from the chaos. Once they were out of earshot, he spoke quietly. "You see? He's desperate." "I'm not scared," she whispered, though a tremor laced her words. She realized it wasn't entirely true. A man like Victor, with potential criminal connections, could be dangerous even if convicted. But she also knew that living in fear wouldn't help. "Stay strong," Boone said. "The jury sees who he really is now." That meltdown just sealed the impression he's as ruthless as the evidence suggests. They returned to the courtroom, waiting. Hours drifted by. The clock struck 4 p.m., then 5 o'clock. At last, near dusk, word came. The jury had reached a verdict. People rushed to find seats. Felicia's heart hammered. Victor re-entered, subdued but still brimming with tension. His face was ashen. The jury filed in, each expression cryptic. The foreperson, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair, clutched a slip of paper. Judge Ramirez cleared her throat. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." She handed the paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Silence gripped the courtroom so tightly, one could almost hear the anxious breathing of the crowd. Judge Ramirez scanned the slip. Her expression didn't change, but she nodded curtly. She returned her gaze to the jury. "In the matter of United States v. Victor Barlow, on the charges of fraud and money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charges related to conspiracy to aid and abet arms trafficking, we find the defendant guilty." A wave of reaction swept the room. Some gasped, Others exhaled in relief. Cameras clicked rapidly. Victor gripped the defense table so hard, his knuckles turned white. Ross hung his head. Judge Ramirez tapped her gavel. Court officers, please take Mr. Barlow into custody. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. Two uniformed deputies stepped forward. In that moment, Victor's posture crumbled. He looked around as if searching for a lifeline, but found none. The clang of cuffs around his wrists punctuated the finality. For all his arrogance, his empire had collapsed. Felicia sat perfectly still, tears pricking her eyes. She felt a profound mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief for justice served, sorrow for all the pain that had led here. She caught Boone's glance across the courtroom, and he offered a proud nod. Her breath trembled as she realized that her grandmother's house, and so many others, had been avenged. Victor was led away through a side door, the last trace of his swagger gone. The spectators began to disperse, some patting Felicia on the back, others clamoring for a quote. Foster turned to her. He's found guilty on all major counts. That's a victory, Felicia. She managed a shaky smile. A big one. For my grandmother, too. Commander Boone approached, removing his cover and holding it under one arm. You did it, he said softly. I'm glad I could help. A swirl of reporters pressed forward. Felicia and Boone were ushered away by the bailiff, the cameras trailing them. The entire trial, from a local real estate scam to an international money laundering conspiracy, had concluded in a single, thunderous moment. And in that moment, justice had the final word. 3 weeks later, Felicia found herself walking a familiar street in Bayview City's old district, where her grandmother's house once stood. The Victorian home still rose proudly, painted sky blue with white trim. Since the conviction, Redwood Realty's assets had been frozen, and restitution processes were underway. Felicia hoped her family might reclaim the property, or at least be compensated fairly. Stepping onto the porch, she recalled her childhood memories. The squeak of the rocking chair, the subtle perfume of her grandmother's magnolia blossoms. She was here to meet a city official about clarifying the property's status. It wasn't guaranteed, but with Redwood's unscrupulous dealings exposed, a judge had opened the door to reversal of fraudulent sales. She lingered on the porch, thinking of Victor's meltdown in the courtroom. He would soon face sentencing on multiple felony counts. The maximum penalty was decades in prison. Poetic justice, she thought. The man who once exuded invincibility was now stuck in a jail cell, the full force of the federal system bearing down on him. The screen door behind her creaked, and Commander Boone's voice called out, "Felicia?" She turned, startled. She hadn't realized he'd arrived. He wore civilian clothes now, khaki pants and a polo shirt, yet he still carried that upright bearing that marked his military discipline. "Commander Boone, Mark," she corrected herself. "What brings you here?" He offered an easy grin. "I had some time before I fly back to Coronado. Foster mentioned you were finalizing some paperwork. Thought I'd see how you're holding up." Felicia's heart warmed at his thoughtfulness. "I'm okay. Better than okay, actually. Just waiting to see if the judge will restore the title. Grandma's in a senior living center now, but I'd love for her to see her house back in the family." Boone glanced at the weathered steps. "It's a beautiful home. You have good memories here." "The best," she sighed softly. "What about you? Heading back to your duties?" He nodded. "Yes. The Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado. There's always more training, or missions, to prep for." A breeze rustled the porch swing. She found herself curious. "You've done so much, risking your life overseas, and yet you still made time to testify in a fraud case. I never really asked why did you step up like that." He shrugged, a humble gesture. "When you see money from these corrupt operations feeding violence abroad, you realize it starts somewhere. Often, that somewhere is home. If I can help shut down even a fraction of that pipeline, I will. And folks like you, civilians who refuse to let criminals run amok, are part of that solution." The sincerity of his words struck her. She gazed at him for a moment. "I'm glad we crossed paths." He smiled. "Me too." They lingered in companionable silence, listening to the distant murmur of city traffic. Felicia thought of how her voice alone might not have been enough to topple Victor, but combined with Boone's evidence and the prosecution's thorough approach, justice prevailed. It was a reminder of how different forms of bravery, legal, personal, and military, could come together to protect the vulnerable. Eventually, the city official arrived. Felicia walked inside to discuss the property's legal status. Boone waited on the porch, letting her handle business. She emerged about 20 minutes later, a faint glow in her eyes. They're pushing through the motion to revoke Redwood's deeds. It'll take a few more weeks, but the city's on our side. Boone nodded approvingly. That's good news. Let me know when it's official. I'd love to hear your grandmother's reaction. Felicia found herself laughing, the first truly joyful laugh since the trial began. She'll probably say, "About time those fools learned not to mess with the Rivers." He joined her laughter, then checked his watch. "I need to head out soon, catch my flight. But that if you're ever in Coronado, maybe I can show you around the base. Or, just grab coffee." Felicia felt her cheeks warm. "I'd like that. Thank you, Mark." They shook hands, though the moment felt like it carried more meaning than a formal goodbye. As Boone descended the steps, Felicia watched him go, reflecting on the strange, unexpected friendship that had sprung from a web of deception and crime. Within minutes, the quiet street fell still. Felicia drew a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs. She walked down the porch steps to the sidewalk, heart lightened by the knowledge that the house, and many others, could soon be returned to rightful owners. She recalled Victor's final, furious glare, and she whispered into the gentle breeze, "Enjoy prison, Victor. Karma's not done with you yet." A month later, the sentencing hearing took place in a less crowded courtroom. The media had already milked the trial's drama, and only a few local reporters remained. Victor Barlow, dressed in prison khakis, stood before Judge Ramirez with slumped shoulders. Gone was the arrogance that once radiated from him. Felicia sat in the gallery, her grandmother's frail hand clasped in hers. Loretta had insisted on attending, despite her age. Commander Boone was back on duty in Coronado, but Foster and the prosecution team were present. Judge Ramirez, in calm yet unyielding tones, reviewed Victor's crimes: real estate fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to aid arms trafficking. She cited the extensive evidence, the damage to countless families, and the risk to international security. "Mr. Barlow," she concluded, "your actions represent a grievous breach of public trust. You exploited the vulnerable at home and financed violence abroad. Therefore, I hereby sentence you to 35 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole before serving 28 of those years, and restitution in the amount of $4.2 million to the identified victims." Victor let out a defeated exhale, shoulders caving. He glanced at Felicia and Loretta in one last attempt at intimidation, but Felicia held his gaze without flinching. The bailiff escorted him away, the heavy door clanging shut, marking the end of Victor Barlow's illusions of power. Outside in the hallway, Loretta pressed Felicia's hand. "You did it, baby," she murmured, tears in her clouded eyes. "We might get our house back, but more important, you showed him he couldn't just steamroll us." Felicia hugged her grandmother. "We did it, Grandma. You gave me the strength." Reporters approached, microphones extended, but Felicia gently waved them off. This moment belonged to her family. She led Loretta out of the courthouse, into the warm, late-afternoon sun, free from the weight of Victor's threats. Within weeks, Redwood Realty was dissolved, its assets liquidated. Families who had been duped began reclaiming their homes or receiving financial compensation. Loretta's beloved Victorian was returned to her name, though she chose to remain in her new senior living community. She often visited the old house with Felicia, rocking peacefully on the porch while humming gospel tunes that whispered of resilience and faith. And in a small Navy training facility at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Boone heard the final word of Victor's sentence. A quiet sense of satisfaction washed over him. Another threat neutralized, another criminal chain snapped. Yes, there were countless more battles to be fought. His day-to-day life remained a swirl of exercises, missions, and training the next generation of SEALs. But this victory in the courtroom rather than on the battlefield felt just as meaningful. From that day on, whenever Felicia considered her ordeal, she recalled not only the horror of losing her grandmother's house, but also the power of speaking up. She realized that sometimes, justice demanded not only one person's courage but the confluence of many: a determined granddaughter, a meticulous prosecution team, and a principled Navy SEAL had joined forces to stop a dangerous criminal.